In this video, I'm going to show you the basic layout of ProTools first and where you can find everything and the basic working environment. So right now I have a session loaded in ProTools and there are two tracks loaded here. We have an audio track and you can see that we have two little clips here and the information looks like audio. You can see the waveforms here. And there's something called a MIDI track here and you can see this piano roll. This information right here. So this is MIDI. Along the top, we have some menu items here, things that we'll be using fairly often. Obviously, we'll be saving things here. You can import and export. This will become important later on. All the normal edit features we have in any application. To add a new track, we go to here under track and hit new. And then in ProTools first, we can create audio tracks, aux inputs, a master fader, MIDI track, and MIDI instrument track. To start with, I recommend using just audio tracks and instrument tracks. Audio and instrument tracks can be either mono or stereo. For instrument tracks, I do recommend that you use a stereo track for that. And in terms of whether to see it in samples or ticks, I also again recommend using ticks for this. So when I create it, there's our new track down here. I can make it bigger or smaller by clicking on the bottom here and dragging it, making it bigger or smaller that way. I can also make the whole view bigger and smaller by clicking on these little plus and minus sounds down here. And I can zoom in and out horizontally by sliding this slider here as well. There's also a plus and minus button on either side there as well. Additionally, there are some handy shortcuts. If you want to be able to adjust all the track sizes and make them the same, while I'm hovering over an area between two tracks, this little icon shows up or my cursor changes. And now if I hold down the Option key on a Mac or Alt on Windows, I can click and press with my mouse and now everything looks the same size. I'm going to delete this track. So all I have to do is click on it and then Control click and just say delete track. And that gets rid of that other track I created. Up in the top right hand corner, this is our little transport area where we have stop, play, and record buttons, fast forward and rewind. So if I wanted to bring my playback all the way back to the beginning, I can click on this and then hit play. And I can stop it. I can also start anywhere if I click in this timeline here. And if I just hit play now, it'll start from that point. Okay. This area here is where we can have access to things like a metronome. I'll be going over this later when we go over MIDI. This middle area here is where we can see how long our session is, as well as we can also control the view, whether we're looking at, in this case, bars and beats versus then minutes and seconds. So now I changed it to minutes and seconds. And so this tells me, so if I hit play again, it'll follow along where we are. And as we adjust this, you'll notice that we've got a few horizontal bars here. So there's something called markers. This simply is a place where you can add a little marker to remind yourself for sections and things like that. So I could write, intro, and I can even move it if I decide to. The next horizontal line here is meter, and so we can change the meter at any point. So if I just select somewhere in the track and decide I want to switch it to 3/4 or 7/8, I can add a plus sign and change whatever I want to be. I'll make it 3/4. Say OK, and now you can see we have a 3/4 bar that starts from here and goes for the rest of the piece. There's a tempo section here that tells me how fast this is playing back. I can change tempos. So let's say I want to, where it is 3/4, I'm going to change it. I'm going to slow it down. So I'm going to say add a new tempo, and I'm going to say quarter note equals 88 and hit OK. And now you can see that changed it down. You'll also notice it changed the MIDI, the durations here, because it's a slower tempo. And finally, this section here, this line shows us minutes and seconds. If we want to look at bars and beats, we're going to change that right here and say bars and beats, and now it changes this to bars and beats. There's a really important section right underneath this, and this is the grid button here. And what this is actually shows or hides the grid. This is particularly handy when we want to line up music to a beat, whether we're dealing with lining up things in terms of seconds, or in particular when we're dealing with MIDI tracks, bars and beats. So if I turn on the grid, you can see these lines. So what we have are, these are bar numbers here. And as I zoom in, right, you can start to see different aspects of this. So let me actually, and if I want to change the grid size, I'm going to click on right here, this little triangle, and this is where I can change the grid to be, let's say, 16th notes. Now we can see each little line is a 16th note. Here's bar 1, here's halfway through the bar, here's bar 2, etc. So again, to change the grid size, I'm just going to click on here and make them quarter notes now, and now I'm seeing quarter notes. I'm going to zoom back out a little bit. This is our, this whole area here on the left top is where we have a lot of tools that we can use to move things around and edit in ProTools. There is this, this is a zoom, so I can zoom in, or with Alt on a PC or Option on a Mac, I can zoom out. So it only works when you're in the track area. There is a trim tool here, which lets you trim audio as well as MIDI tracks. You'll notice that even so I trimmed it, it's still there. It just won't play the stuff that's hidden, the sounds that are hidden there. There's also a selection tool, which let you select parts of anything, an audio track, Command C, and then Command V, copy and paste. This also applies to MIDI, Command C, Command V. And you'll notice that anything I selected, it copied. So I caught a little bit of this note here, and it did copy that. And then we have this hand tool, this grabber tool, which lets me move things around. And I can also move them onto different tracks as well. So if I add another audio track, I can't move audio into this track. I'm trying to drop it on the MIDI track, it won't let me, but it lets me drop it onto another audio track. And then there's a pencil tool here, which is handy for drawing automation, which we'll learn about later, as well as when we want to draw in MIDI notes in our clips. And we're going to learn about that later as well. Finally, I can use these three tools together with this Smart tool by selecting this top bar here, which selects all three of these. And if I bring my cursor down, when I'm on the top part of a track or clip, it is the selection tool. When I'm on the lower half, it becomes the grabber tool. And if I come to the edge, it becomes the trim tool. And so I can trim audio and then move it where I want. And again, this also applies to MIDI to move things around and copy and paste and do things like that. So those are our basic tools. There are then three different modes, or four different modes here in terms of user modes, in terms of how we can move around clips within Pro Tools. There's shuffle mode, spot mode, slip mode, and grid mode. In shuffle mode, what happens is if I move a clip, it automatically attaches it to the next clip. So if I actually move this one and try to bring it in front, it'll place it, it'll actually swap those two out. So there's no way I can put a gap in between them. It always tries to connect two clips, and this also goes for MIDI as well. If I grab this, you can only move it there. There's nowhere else. It's going to attach it right to the end of the next clip. Spot mode moves a clip to on my grid. So I'm going to select a section on the grid. So I'm a place on the grid. So that's spot mode. Slip mode just lets me move it wherever I want. So it's completely flexible. I can move it anywhere horizontally. And then grid mode lets me move it, and it attaches it to the grid. So for instance, right now my grid is set to quarter notes. And so every line here is a quarter note, and I can move it automatically to line up to those grids. This also applies to MIDI as well. You notice that there's a couple different, there's absolute and relative. I suggest just keeping on an absolute for now. So for the most part, when you begin working with Pro Tools, I suggest using slip mode or grid mode. And I definitely suggest using slip mode really at the beginning to move things around. And then if you're really using, moving MIDI tracks and things like that, or MIDI clips, you might want to put this on the grid so things stay aligned and such. But either of these are the places where I would definitely start working. As we move down now to the actual tracks, you can see that we have the horizontal track with either audio or MIDI. This is my audio track. There are some buttons here. So there's a record button, record enable, which I don't have an audio interface connected right now, so I don't have a way of doing that. So there's a track input monitor here, a solo button, and then a mute button. The solo button solos this track, mutes all the other tracks. The mute button just mutes this track. If I solo one track and add another track, now these two will play together. This one will be muted. And these buttons also appear on MIDI tracks. There isn't a import monitor button, but there is a record enable button to record MIDI if you have a MIDI keyboard connected to your computer. And then we have our solo and mute buttons. In the audio track, there's also this pull down menu here where we get a few options where we can look at a block. So this now we can see, I can see and move blocks without looking at the actual waveforms. There's the analysis, which shows me analysis information. We'll get into this later. There's warping and waveform. I suggest using waveform for now. We'll talk about the others later. And then there's volume, mute, and pan. So volume, and now what we can do is we can actually affect volume over time and muting, or I can also pan right or left as well. So again, the default is to show the waveform for an audio track. For a MIDI track, there's a few other views. There's blocks, similar to the block view in an audio track. There's the clip view, which lets me see the actual piano roll in the clip, and I can move it. I can't edit the MIDI notes though. If I want to do that, I actually go to notes, and now I can actually grab a couple notes if I want and move them, or move them higher, or add new notes and things like that. There's also velocity, MIDI volume, MIDI mute, MIDI pan, pitch bend, mono aftertouch, program change, Sussex information, and control information. These will all be things that we will look at later on. So probably when you begin, the two that we're going to look at most are notes and velocity. Velocity is the strength with which the note is played. So that's a basic intro to the Pro Tools layout. In the next few tutorials, we'll show you how to actually start working with some MIDI tracks.